Welcome everyone to Realizing the Future We Want, the corporate role in global development. My name's Carmen Perez. I'm with CECP's Research and Measurement team, and this for me is one of my must-see sessions of the day. I'm part of CECP's expansion into global topics, tracking global trends, and so we're so thrilled to have this session, and we're glad you're here for your kickoff breakout session at the summit with a really outstanding and exceptional set of panelists and moderator. My role is just to kind of introduce and kick things off. I think this session is quite interesting because it taps into a few issues that we know are so important to companies. One is tapping into external platforms and ways to share the story about what you're already doing, which the Millennium Development Goals are and Sustainable Development Agenda will be as well. There's an evaluation and measurement component, as the goals typically have a quantitative element and also a collaborative element. The UN as an intergovernmental body creates this excellent platform for collaboration. So excited to hear what the panelists have to say today. And it's my honor to introduce Ms. Heather Grady, our moderator for this session. Currently, she is an advisor for the Conrad Hilton Foundation, deep in this Sustainable Development Agenda issues. Cross-sector in philanthropy, but really well suited to speak to a corporate audience, and previously with the Rockefeller Foundation for many years. And while based in New York, as you can see from her biography, has quite extensive global background. So we're so excited to have her moderate this panel. When preparing for this session, I had to take a quick peek at her Twitter feed and saw that she's also recently back from Kenya and may have some stories to share from that experience. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Grady, and we're excited for this excellent panel.
Carmen. Welcome, all of you. Thank you very much for coming to our session. New York is the right place. How many of you are from New York? And raise your hand if you've come in for this event, but you're based somewhere else. Okay, that's great. So a lot of people based elsewhere. New York is really the place to be when you talk about setting global development goals. Why? Obviously because the United Nations is here. The office across on First Avenue is where the Millennium Development Goals were formulated. About 13 years ago, in 2001, they were launched. The 193 member states of the United Nations are deeply engaged in seeing how we bring the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, to conclusion, and how we're going to create the successor goals. So this morning, in a very short time, what we hope to achieve in this session is to hear about progress and lessons from the MDGs, including how the private sector's contributed, to demystify the process behind setting global goals and frameworks, to showcase examples of how corporations are contributing, to consider ways that business leaders might become involved more, and hopefully to come up with some new connections and partnerships and actionable ideas. So let me introduce first our panelists. Their full bios are in your program, but Georg Kell is going to open first, and he'll pick up on how the United Nations sees the goals going forward. Georg is the executive director of the UN Global Compact, the world's largest voluntary corporate sustainability initiative. He was one of the architects of the Global Compact and has led it since its founding in the year 2000. And he was also involved in the early days of many initiatives, including the Principles for Responsible Investment, which I'm sure some of you know about. We'll then hear from Sharon Catherine D'Agostino. She's Vice President for Corporate Citizenship at Johnson & Johnson. She works with the company's senior leadership to drive the citizenship and sustainability strategy and implementation of a broad range of corporate responsibility initiatives. After that, we'll hear from Imad Bibawi, KPMG's global lead partner for the United Nations and a partner in KPMG LLP's risk consulting practice. He oversees the firm's work, collaborations, and relationships with the United Nations, and is also a member of KPMG's Corporate Social Responsibility Council. Finally, we'll hear from Andrew Park, a senior sustainability strategist in Bloomberg's Global Sustainability Group. He reports to the chairman's office and integrates sustainability into all operations and manages the sustainability group's corporate philanthropic portfolio. He also was a special assistant to the COO of Bloomberg Philanthropies, Mike Bloomberg's private foundation, which is really one of the big new actors on the foundation scene. So the theme of this session, as Carmen said, is very pertinent to many of the companies at this summit. And as the keynote speaker this morning, Jeremy Hyman, spoke about from purpose, I think today's world is very different than it was in the past. The way that we build collaborations, the way that we build movements for social and economic change is quite different. So those are some of the themes we'll be picking up on. The goals that drive global development frameworks, like the Millennium Development Goals and their successor, the post-2015 Agenda, those goals are seen by governments, the member states of the United Nations, as very much being created within the confines of the multilateral system, with governments in charge. But of course, what we know today is that there's no way to achieve these ambitious goals unless we have, as we might say, all hands on deck. It's a much wider range of stakeholders that need to be involved. We no longer assume that only governments are responsible for setting, tracking, and reaching these targets. Let's just take a look at some of the numbers. And I apologize to my panelists. I'll try to go through this quickly. First of all, something that that UNDP has called not only a shift in the geography of need, but also a shift in the geography of wealth. But first of all, more poor people live now in middle income versus low income countries. By 2030, most of the absolute poor will live in fragile states, and there are increasing stressors like climate change and urbanization. In the past, most of international development assistance came from official donors, but today a great deal of it is in private hands. This includes finance held by pension funds and corporations, FDI, remittances, which have become huge, impact investments, small but growing, and private philanthropy. Some of this is intentionally deployed toward global goals, but much of it isn't. Much of it isn't really coordinated. So the theme really is how to leverage the giving of companies and private philanthropies and private wealth against the official development assistance. This slide shows how by 2011, ODA, official development assistance, was only about $150 billion of a total of about $900 billion that was going into developing countries. A very different picture from 13 years ago when the MDGs were launched. But how's it being deployed? Could it be deployed more effectively if there was more collaboration and coordination? And I just want to mention, this is the topic of work that we are doing at the Conrad Hilton Foundation, trying to build a platform for philanthropy, working with the UN Development Program and the Foundation Center to help philanthropies engage more. And I know that Georg's going to talk more about how the UN Global Compact is doing something similar. This also shows the difference in the spending. You can see FDI and private debt and portfolio equity going up and down over the years, remittances climbing up steadily, but ODA really climbing very slowly as compared to the total. Two more thoughts just before the end of the PowerPoint. First of all, some lessons that the UN has documented about where there's something of a mismatch. First, a lot of the support from the private sector goes into specific sectors like natural resource extraction or labor-intensive industries. How can that giving be more spread? And how can we create more shared value that crosses more sectors? It usually goes to certain countries, middle-income countries. How can it be spread more widely across the developing world? And also, financial flows can be more volatile. How can we make sure that more of it is given toward long-term development needs? Finally, just where we are today in terms of the post-2015 agenda. First, there is a push to really achieve the Millennium Development Goals as much as possible in the last couple of years. There are a set of countries where there's something called the MDG Acceleration Framework. Secondly, we know that the process has been underway for about 2 years to create the successor goals, Sustainable Development Goals, the post-2015 agenda. The aim is to have one framework that brings together social, environmental, and economic goals. There's an open working group at the United Nations that's working on more than 15 focus areas, many of the topics that your companies are interested in: poverty, sustainable agriculture, health, energy, biodiversity. By September, a report of this process and draft text will be submitted. So those negotiations are going to continue until an agreement is achieved in September of next year. Before I ask Georg to really share his view about how things have changed, I want to just point out a few debates that are going on. First of all, how many goals should there be? A short list or a long list? Secondly is what goes in these goals. For example, should human rights be incorporated? Should climate change be incorporated? It's hotly debated. Another one is how those of us who aren't representing government should be involved in this process. So, Georg, let me now turn over to you. And I'd like to ask you, you were here, you were at the UN, I think since 1987, so you were around when the MDGs were created. How do you see this process as different from the creation of the MDGs? And particularly, how have companies been involved differently?
Well, Heather, first of all, I think you have said it almost all already. It's great stage setting. Obviously, the Sustainable Development Goals are, for the first time ever, an effort by the United Nations to create genuinely global goals. The MDGs were north-south oriented, and they were basically geared towards the official development agenda giving dimension. The MDGs were cooked up in a small office together with John Ruggie. I had the pleasure collaborating there. And then they were presented to the world. And at the head of state meeting, basically, heads of states' arms were twisted to embrace them, including by George W., who went to the Millennium Summit in 2000. This time around, the approach is very different, a very inclusive approach, a very bottom-up approach, global consultations, civil society, business, and a genuine effort to build global goals which are relevant to all countries and to all actors in society, north, south, east, west. Whether and how successful politically the SDGs will be needs to be seen, but most likely they will have a huge impact, there will be a huge empowerment, and obviously the more inspirational they are, the greater their impact will be. And by next September, we will know. In the meantime, many actors, especially the private sector, especially business, is gearing up on a scale we have never seen before. We ourselves have worked with 1,700 companies from around the world, produced an architecture for engagement in the post-2015 agenda, which gives the rationale, but also the opportunities. And I want to talk a little bit about the opportunities for business, because what the post-2015 really offers to business in particular, but also to investors, is the opportunity to collaborate on a scale never seen before. From a private sector angle, it's really about implementation, tackling the root causes of what hinders market growth and development. From a private sector, it's really about creating the enabling environment that allows good ideas to grow fast and wide. My personal wish list, by the way, behind the SDGs is that member states, first of all, recommit to the very foundations of the United Nations, a rule-based approach to global integration, to make sure that the very system that enables markets to grow and to blossom is actually strengthened, including multilateral trade, investment, and so forth. Because obviously our prosperity and the big lesson from the MDGs is that the big dent on poverty reduction is almost exclusively due to private sector investment. And it's driven by the business case, it's driven by the desire to grow markets, it's driven by the desire to be successful. And unleashing entrepreneurship and making sure that it's carried forward in a sustainable way is arguably the big historical challenge. Now, what I want to share with you is the level of excitement, why business is getting, according to our observations everywhere, and we are doing consultations in many countries around the world. We will be in Addis Ababa just in 2 weeks to ignite the fire, so to speak, for Africa, which either can be an El Dorado or it can move towards sustainable development pathways. The reason is actually threefold, I believe. In the corporate sustainability responsibility movement, which is now a global movement, undoubtedly, we have 8,000 active companies and other initiatives are booming as well, and standards. The realization is really sinking in that in an era of interdependence and transparency, increasingly it is true that long-term financial success can only be assured if it goes hand in hand with environmental, social responsibility, and good governance ethics. If a company misses out on either of these three complementary necessary preconditions, long-term financial success cannot be assured. And this is a fundamental insight that is driven by basically three macro trends, which I am totally convinced will stay in place and will drive collaboration. First, transparency, like technological change, is irreversible. It makes increasingly sense for business actors to actually measure and to show what contributions they make to social environmental development. It makes sense. The world is becoming more transparent. So being proactive there makes sense increasingly as a risk mitigation tool, but also as an opportunity tool. Secondly, foreign direct investment, the major vehicle through which business has gone global, has undergone a paradigm shift. Until not long ago, it was largely about extracting cheap inputs into some processes to be sold in established markets. No longer. Economic growth has migrated to the east, to the south. Foreign direct investment is increasingly about building markets. In other words, it's a long-term bet for the future, which makes business a stakeholder in society, which makes business a partner in overcoming barriers, whether it's on the education side, lack of skills, whether it's on natural resource management side, scarcity of water, necessary input, and so forth. So this is a huge paradigm shift which really makes business increasingly a partner for collaboration. And thirdly, the most tricky of all is that as demographics and technology, and I should add geopolitics have changed, we don't really talk about it here, but it is much of the underlying force behind it. It is also true that the dividing line between public and private roles and responsibilities is becoming fuzzy. Think about water, think about the air, the ultimate public goods. Everybody, of course, has a right to clean water and to clean air, but we know the realities of today. We have to put a price on water and air. What a paradigm shift to the past. And that to business means either to be part of sorting out this fuzzy gray zone or waiting until it's dictated to you. Clearly, it's better to be part of it. That's why I think the global trends that I just listed clearly make the case for business to be part of the solution and increasingly showing that they are so. What also has changed, and I'm convinced of it, until not so long ago, most companies were in it largely to respond to challenges. Once crisis hits, you learn costly mistakes, or to differentiate themselves, to show I'm better than my competitors or peers. Fair enough, that agenda is still very much relevant. But increasingly, businesses realize that through collaboration, you can actually bring good efforts to scale and you can genuinely change market conditions. You can overcome corruption. You can tackle skill shortage problems. You can actually build health systems that ensure higher productivity and serve the public good. And this collaborative aspect is the promise of the SDGs. And we are running 8 global, very big issue platforms from climate change, women empowerment, anti-corruption, and they're all booming. The latest one, Business for Peace and Business and the Rule of Law, is taking off unbelievably. 60 companies already buying into the notion, promoting commercial law, and the rule of law is one way to actually produce more benefits. So the business case really has gotten stronger, and the SDGs offer an opportunity for business to collaborate, to pool efforts, and to bring good solutions to scale in the hope that we also tackle some of the systemic underlying shortcomings. I don't want to go into the underlying shortcomings, but it's also important that almost all human suffering is man-made, that government governance failure is reason number one why we have poverty, why we have violence, why we don't have entrepreneurship growing in many parts of the world, and therefore tackling also the governance issue, anti-corruption, rule of law, building markets is essential, and the SDGs have that in their provision. I hope it will stay there politically, because if that stays there, I think we can really, really make a genuine contribution to humanity by growing responsible markets more widely.
Thank you. Before we move on, can I just ask, picking up on some of the themes earlier this morning, when you see companies engaging in the way you're talking about, do you think that's coming top down, that there's a CEO or someone in a senior position who says we have to get on board with this, or do you see it bubbling up from staff across the country?
Both at the same time. We still see a lot of top-down, really CEO-led activities, very important. But increasingly, we see a lot of bottom-up changes. We have 100 country networks now around the world. 6,000 of our 8,000 active corporate participants are actually not the very big ones, but it's the smaller companies, and they have as much a desire, if not a bigger desire, to reduce uncertainty, to deal with negative externalities. They feel it daily. just a moving story. I was recently in Pakistan with our network there, and the companies there are desperate, obviously. The security costs unbelievable, the police so corrupt, the environment so hostile to genuine responsible entrepreneurship that you really wish them well. And what they do, they pool efforts to invest in youth skill development because they feel that's one way of tackling the long-term threat of extremism and corruption and unemployment. So it's increasingly the idea and practice of corporate responsibility has gone global. It has been rooted now in so many languages and cultures. I think the challenge now is to nurture and to culture these bottom-up movements and to complement them with top-down approaches and thereby look for the reinforcement. In between, I may sound a bit too over the top now, but there are new tools available, global action hubs. We launched some really exciting stuff on our website just yesterday on that, how you can connect the global with the local on energy, water, anti-corruption, social entrepreneurship, and of course, UN partnerships as well. Mm-hmm. So technology empowers, can reduce transaction costs, very important, but the drivers come both top-down and bottom-up.
Thank you. Sharon, at Johnson & Johnson, you have really been an individual and some advocate for global health issues, especially maternal and child health, and I think you've really made a huge difference in the company. And I know that you were one of the advocates or the main advocate for Johnson & Johnson joining the Every Woman, Every Child campaign of the UN Secretary General. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And I think, and we've talked about how you made you feel it's fine for a company to make a commitment and then meet it. In other words, to take a bit of a risk in doing that. Can you talk a little bit about your philosophy and how that happened?
I will, absolutely. And I would first clarify that while this is a personal passion, it's also a corporate passion. We have a long legacy of work in maternal and child health and survival at Johnson & Johnson. And I thought that for colleagues from the private sector, I would talk a bit about why we made the commitment, briefly what the commitment was, and then a couple of how things have gone since we made the commitment, because I think that's a practical way of looking at things. So why we made the commitment, for those who are focused on global public health, will remember that in April of, or at least the spring of 2010, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon issued a call to action because at the 10-year mark of the 15-year Millennium Development Goals, many countries were woefully behind on MDGs 4 and 5, maternal and child health and survival. And so there was this call to action for a renewed commitment. And one of the things that shifted a bit in that call to action was that, at least for us, we saw an opening to the private sector that hadn't really been so clear before. I will say that in the world of global public health, there is some enthusiasm for the private sector and some skepticism, honestly. But this was a moment, and when we looked at the work that we had been doing, both from the corporate center with partners, but also our colleagues around the world were doing, especially in regions we call at Johnson & Johnson Asia Pacific and Latin America, there's a great body of work in maternal and child health and survival. So we said, we're doing this work, we're going to make this forward-looking commitment. Johnson & Johnson had not made forward-looking commitments. Our strategic philanthropy is really not the foundation. It's driven by our business. And so we know in making a forward-looking commitment, the challenges of saying, if we do this and we make this commitment, whatever happens from a business perspective, we out there said we're doing this, this is what we're doing. So, but we decided we were going to make a 5-year commitment. And our commitment was to reach, by 2015, to reach in that year 120 million women and children in 50 of the 75 focus countries for MDGs 4 and 5. And we decided that we would focus on a mix of things we knew really very well. So we work with a number of partners on safe childbirth programs. We would continue to do work there. That was one of our focus areas. Another focus area is eliminating a mother-to-child transmission of HIV. We worked with several partners for a decade in eliminating new pediatric AIDS infections. A Produce to Give program where we have a deworming medication, and so we committed to taking that Produce to Give commitment from 50 million doses a year to 200 million doses a year by 2015. So those of you who are familiar with all of the operational challenges of scaling up a drug that you're really not selling a lot of, but you need to manufacture a lot of, was one of the challenges we faced. And then two other areas I would highlight. One was an area for us, which is mobile outreach to new and expecting moms, especially in low resource settings. And we did not have a lot of experience in that, but we had a lot of experience through one of our operating companies, Baby Center, which is an expert in giving stage-based information to new and expecting moms. And so we thought there's some ways that we can leverage that. That new area has turned out to be really exciting and really challenging for us, and I'll talk about that a bit in the how. And then finally, because we are a healthcare company, there was a commitment around research and development in diseases, especially HIV and TB, that disproportionately affect women and children in low resource settings. So that was our commitment. And I'd like to shift then to the how. So once we made this commitment in September of 2010, we had all of the obvious discussions that you'd have in a big decentralized corporation about how are we really going to do this? How are we going to measure it? How are we aligning resources? Were we to have challenges from a business perspective, which I'm happy to say we did not have to deal with this question, but we had to ask the question of what happens now that we've made this commitment, and what happens if we have issues with the business? And now we've really gone very public with this. The two big how questions for us have been one in the area of public-private partnerships, because they're hard. We love them, but they're hard. They take a lot of energy, a lot of effort, and in that old model of forming, storming, norming, and performing, there's a lot that is in that those first stages. And so that was a how that I will say, struggled a bit with. And since the second how that I would reference here is because the theme of this conference is what counts. For us, the question was who counts? 120 million women and children, how are we capturing the data? How are we capturing it from big programs and small programs? Are we talking about primary beneficiaries or anyone touched? Those kinds of debates. And so what we learned in making this commitment was that it was really exciting, very galvanizing for a number of people and groups across the corporation, and immediately sparked for us a number of invitations to talk with many other organizations, both NGOs, governments, other private sector players who were focused on maternal and child health and survival. So that's been an exciting piece, but also quite a time-consuming piece. And in wrapping up, I would say that as we reached the midpoint of our commitment, when we looked through 2012, we were at a point of reaching in that year 63.5 million women and children, so we were halfway there, and we were had already achieved the goal of the number of countries that we were working in, which for us is a less important goal, but is an important goal nonetheless.
Thank you very much. And tell us, which UN agencies do you tend to interact with on this?
We work with the UN H4+, which is actually 6 agencies, but the Health 4+. We work most closely with UNFPA, but we also work with UNAIDS, UN Women, and UNICEF, of course.
Thank you. Imad, In your role at KPMG, you're global lead partner for the United Nations. That somehow seems a daunting,
I know, isn't it? It's lovely.
a daunting title. We've touched on a bit the cultural differences between the way governments and the UN works and the way that companies and large corporations, or indeed I would say small and medium enterprises work is very different. Can you talk a little bit about how to bridge those differences and how you've done it in your own career, and how does KPMG do it?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having us at this conference. I think it's amazing that CECP actually pulls this together. And I actually volunteered for this role. I raised my hand and I said, I absolutely have to be the global lead partner I'm Egyptian, I grew up in Ethiopia, and I have a personal passion, so similar to you, when you've got a personal passion, you try and make it all work. But I think we've operated, if you think about the post-2015 development goals, or the how do you bridge all of that gap, we've operated under 3 assumptions. And one, I'm paraphrasing what some others have said at the United Nations: business is development and development is business. So they're both hand in hand. You can't think of them as 2 separate things. Number 2, the markets that we're talking about that need development, whether it's Africa, Asia, or Latin America, or any others, those markets are at a stage of maturity today and developing at a pace that's phenomenal. And every single one of these companies that's represented here and more are very active in those markets. And the third hypothesis is, well, no one company, no one government, no one agency can actually do it on its own. So business is development, it's happening as we speak, and you can't do it alone. So we stepped back and said, as a KPMG firm, we have a relationship with the United Nations where we're a service provider, but we're a partner. We're also, similar to the UN and other firms, a galvanizing force in terms of bringing people and communities together. So back to the plenary session that we had earlier today, where they're talking about community building and they're talking about business playing a role in the future, it all linked with these 3 hypotheses that we have. And we stepped back and said, well, how could we actually help? How could we make this a reality? And you look at the SDGs, in whatever form, numbers, or detail that they have some fundamental commonalities: eradicating poverty, healthcare, sustainable energy, if you will. And we stepped back and said, but when you talk about private sector is not one size fits all. Large global companies operate differently than mid-sized companies. A financial services organization is very different in what it wants to do in these markets compared to an energy company. So why don't we step back and say, what is the ask of each one of these industries, if you will, against these sustainable development goals? And let's try and bridge that gap between the goals themselves that are very broad and very aspirational and the right thing to do, to the industries that are actually going to influence this, and say, by industry, by goal, why don't we start thinking about what you could do and contribute? So to J&J's example, even though it's not necessarily linked to the SDGs as they will be, what you're doing is essentially the development work that the SDGs want to happen in those markets. So 1, you're articulating the message, this is what you could do. Number 2, you're starting to create the communities around these goals by industries to say, you're already doing it, so let's start take credit for it. And number 3, let's get more companies in those industries to operate in the same mindset. And if you notice, none of this is about CR or citizenship or sustainability. It's about just good business. 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies are in Africa. Another role that I have is I'm responsible for the Africa, US, and Middle East US corridors. And in both of those, when you look at those markets and what our clients are doing in those markets, it's phenomenal growth. It's phenomenal investment. Yes, there are questions around corruption, and yes, there are questions around what is the right model, what is the right tax structure, all of that. But those questions were asked of India, China, and Brazil 20 years ago, and yet those markets are where the growth are today. So if you look at where the SDGs are focused for the future, and you look at the companies that are already operating there, you bridge that gap by creating an ask and say, for this goal, for this industry, we think you could do X. And we want to be that galvanizing force that brings those companies together. Now, you also turn this slide and say, well, if I'm an organization that is very partial to what the UN is doing, or an organization that isn't partial to what the UN is doing, irrespective of that, these are things that are going to create better markets for these organizations to grow and flourish. And if they don't do it in a sustainable way, you're eventually going to have the hiccups that you're worried about. So the risks of corruption and the risks of a lack of talented workforce, or the risk of unfair tax legislation, whatever the risk is of operating in that market, if you don't play a role as an organization in influencing what that creates and also developing those markets, you're going to fall behind compared to your peers and compared to the others in other industries. So KPMG has a very active and a healthy relationship with the UN. We're very proud of it, but we're also very proud of our position and relationship in the markets, both here in the US and around the world. And we want to use that to create a matrix, if you will, of asks by industry, by goal, so that we can galvanize communities against these goals and hopefully create that better world that we all are working very hard to achieve.
Thank you. And that kind of information gathering you're doing, is that available publicly? Or is that something that you might consider making available publicly?
We will make it available publicly.
Okay.
In fact, there's a whole vetting process that we're going through and discussions with various internal and external leaders. But I think this community, as I was listening to it earlier today, would benefit tremendously from what those asks could be, so that you might want to do philanthropy on one side, but at least if you have a framework that aligns all of your activities to a certain direction that your industry is taking and can help create those markets, there may be better linkages, and you might ultimately create more impact by doing that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. We had a planning call for this panel. It was very interesting because we recognized that there's a spectrum in corporate responsibility, from companies that really are doing this from a shared value approach, which is really what Imad was stressing about, how it's good for business and it's good for the community, but also many companies that are giving simply because it's in their ethos and not necessarily related to making the business case. I was just thinking, Carmen mentioned, I've just returned from Kenya, and in Kenya, it's very obvious. It's an incredibly connected economy in terms of mobile telephony and pretty robust growth rate and so on. But I was up in the arid regions in the north toward the border with Somalia with people who literally, they're not even qualified yet to take a microfinance loan of $100. So Kenya is facing really stark inequality, as many countries are. So one question we might think about is, does that mean companies shouldn't really engage in supporting people really at the very poorest populations, or is there still a role for business even when addressing the so-called ultra-poor? So I think sometimes that might not be profitable, but it might still be an interesting destination for corporate involvement. But we can maybe talk about that a bit more. What's your view on that?
My only comment on that is if you look at it maybe a little bit differently, you're doing both at the end of the day. So if a company sees, let's take KPMG. Our future success is based on the right markets, economies, and successful companies, but it's also about having a workforce that's out there that's either creating those companies or working for KPMG. So in our CR, or our view of the future, we have to focus on that bottom of the pyramid to get the education level and their skill level to the point where they can either create the companies or work for KPMG or other firms. So at the end of the day, it's not necessarily philanthropic, and we look at it that it's a shared value because we're creating the educational platforms to make sure that those people can ultimately work in those economies. And so I don't think you can, in my view, label it philanthropy or shared value. At the end of the day, it's the right thing to do, and it will create those markets.
Thank you. And of course, also countries that have more inequality are more unstable.
Correct.
And that's, I think, difficult for business overall. Correct. Before I turn to Andrew, I want to mention, we were talking about the post-2015 process. There's a parallel process, of course, of climate change negotiations. And those are centered around Bonn, where the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is hosted. Of course, they also take place in countries that revolve around the world every year, an annual conference. Those negotiations are also, I would say, more contentious than the negotiations that are going on around the Sustainable Development Goals. But anyone who works in development knows that the issues of climate change and the effects on weather and so on are having an enormous impact. So companies like, say, Swiss Re or Unilever and a whole host of companies are really looking more and more at the whole question of climate change impacts.
Well, Heather, allow me on that point. The good news is that governments in their wisdom have now finally basically agreed to include in the SDGs also climate goals. So climate will be part of the global development goals.
So you're betting on climate staying in?
Yes, if you see about developments as they're unfolding around the world, where adaptation is not just a threat for or challenge for the future, but a reality
today.
of today, and scarcity issues on natural resources, pollution. We have a big climate summit in China upcoming just in 2 weeks, right, Mang? And it's driven really, something is changing fundamentally on that front. I think the whole global warming is no longer a perception, it's felt as a reality. And that has huge development implications. So more and more developing countries are actually making the case to include it.
There's definitely action. I hope those goals stay in. We'll
Yes.
see. I hope you're right. So Andrew, coming to that point, as senior sustainability strategist at Bloomberg, you're focused on promoting sustainability finance and also advocating for climate issues, so in different ways. But Bloomberg, of course, is the master at data analytics. And can you talk a little bit more about how you have a core competency in that area? How do you bring that to bear on this area of work?
And before I say anything to all my fellow seasonal allergy sufferers, it's been a brutal couple days. Yeah, like you, I am high on Claritin right now. So if I don't make any sense, let's blame it on over-the-counter seasonal allergy drugs. So to your question about data analytics, and I think Imad was actually kind of talking about this as well. I think companies do best when they do what they do best, meaning they focus on their core competency as part of a way to start engaging in issues outside of the company. And I think at Bloomberg, we have built up a fairly significant infrastructure around data and analytics. And so we turn to that as the platform by which we then engage on these larger issues around climate change and sustainability writ large. So to kind of just talk a little bit about what that looks like internally, the sustainability group itself has its roots in, like many of these operations, within making the company a greener place, so a more efficient place, or a less putting out fewer emissions and that kind of thing. And as we grew savings from all of that, the company then started to expand its goals within sustainability to things that reached outwards. And so my portfolio spans two parts of this. It's both on the product development side and on the NGO and nonprofit engagement side. And those two things are very interrelated because as we see it right now, and apologies to any finance people who might be in the room, but we're not seeing a lot of really strong thought leadership in the sustainability realm, in sustainable finance, coming directly out of finance, certainly, not from our customer base just yet. I think what we're starting to see is an awareness that these issues are starting to thread through what they do on a day-to-day basis. But even now, if you were to stop a typical financial analyst from one of the big banks and just say, do you care about sustainability? Chances are the person will say something like, well, I personally do, but you should ask my portfolio manager if she does. And within that mix, what you find is if you start digging around, in fact, a lot of what these financial analysts already do day to day is in fact sustainability related. A lot of their analysis is taking data from quote unquote non-financial sources and threading it through whatever valuation models or whatever it is they're doing on a day-to-day basis. They just don't see that yet as sustainability. So in some ways, there's just a language problem out there that we encounter every day. But what we've been doing since 2008 is building an extensive database around non-financial data, what we call ESG, environment, social, and governance. We currently have about 5,000, more than 5,000, but somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 companies for which we have a full complement of ESG data. If you look at G data, so we're talking about everything from exec comp to how boards are structured, and that's where a lot of the interest has been over the last couple of years. We get over 10,000 companies that have that data available. And what we're finding is that since 2008, there's been a 50% year-over-year increase in usage of that data. And that, by the way, is not counting the incidental clicks. These are not people who have just randomly happened on the ESG data set and just clicked around. These are people who are actively downloading huge data sets for actual manipulation and internal modeling. So we are not actually capturing even the people who are just sort of discovering it now. So what we're seeing is a fairly strong trend in its usage. I mean, it's still a challenge for us in terms of understanding exactly how they're using that data. I think that still remains an open question, but it is a fairly strong trend that we're seeing. And so the way that the work between the NGO engagement and the product development works is that what we try to do is look to the NGO and nonprofit community to kind of show us the way in terms of where we need to be thinking about, say, capacity building on the part of the investment community. Do they really understand how to use this data effectively? And we're not always talking about the SRI community, the socially responsible investment community, which has already been doing this for years. We're talking about mainstream analysts and people who are starting to connect up the headlines that they're reading around climate change and saying, what if this has something to do with my portfolio risk? How do I start modeling that out, and how do I make those connections? So to give you a couple quick examples around what we're doing within the Sustainable Finance Program is we're not only building out the ESG product, which is all about public equities. We're starting to move that out into other asset classes. We're looking at trying to develop the green bonds market. We're trying to make that visible so that somebody can go onto the terminal and say, give me all the green bonds within this region with these kinds of issuers with this sort of yield. I mean, it's very, very difficult to do that right now. We're working to try, as Georg mentioned, ecosystem services valuation is a whole, wild west. There's no standardized way to measure the social cost of water or clean air or any of those things. And as a data analytics company that is all about standardized measurement, we think there's a role for us in trying to figure out what that actually looks like. Can we start modeling this thing out in very, very specific industries first, because it's an incredibly difficult exercise. We're trying to do this right now on water risk. And so we've had to drill way, way, way down because asset-specific data is very, very hard to come by. We have company-level data, but we don't actually know where all your processing plants are or where all the mines are or things like that. So we're starting to work on areas like that to try to give investors tools that enable them to get to that question of how do you price externalities? Because for us, it's still always going to be about bringing value to the customer. So does the customer end up with an investing edge as a result of using all of this additional data? We think that they can, but we need to help them along in trying to figure out exactly what those analytics are. And as Bloomberg likes to say, we don't compete on the data, we compete on the analytics. The data's out there. We want all the data to be out there. But it's really about showing the way in terms of your particular investment goals and how they align with the kind of analytics that we can provide you. So if we can give you a tool, as we launched not too long ago, called the Carbon Risk Valuation Tool, that enables you to then start messing around with some sort of a model that gives you some sense of how much portfolio risk you're exposing yourself to if you're going to hold on to high carbon assets across a variety of different sectors and across a variety of different time horizons. So these are very, very early days. We can't necessarily claim to have a whole suite of decision useful tools just yet, but it does illustrate how our work with the NGO community and the nonprofit community interfaces with our business. And so for us, there's really not much of a line between doing the CSR thing and leveraging philanthropic capital to do the right thing. I mean, we think it's the right thing. It certainly channels the ethos of our founder. And Mike Bloomberg, as many of you in the room know, he's been all over the place. Certainly gives us a lot of cover to do some crazy things because the business might be like, whoa, what are you doing? I was like, well, he's out there doing this stuff. So there's an interesting interplay between the man himself and what the company does. And it certainly does channel that, but I think there's really this very complex interplay between what's a good business case for us and what's going to keep us a vibrant company in the future and how to make the world a better place. I mean, these two things just kind of go hand in hand, at least for us.
Georg, I think you want to come in.
Andrew, I'm so delighted to hear you talking about the ESG analytics. I just want to share with you and also with the public that I'm convinced personally, after 15 years working in that space, that for business and investors to be a genuine part of the solution for all the big picture issues we have here, we have to find a way to integrate it into valuation. Yeah. It's happening partially here and there. We can see some wonderful plants growing here and there, and the momentum is good, but we're just not yet there. That's exactly. And I really believe that this is the big picture thing which will change markets from within, because at the end of the day, all what you're doing, what we have been pushing for, is really making business more sensitive but business recognizing from its own core competency angle that being sensitive actually makes sense. Because if I'm not sensitive, I won't get the skills, I won't get the productivity, I won't have the water, I won't, and so forth. So, and we don't care about the label too, like you don't, but at its core, it's about integrating into strategies and operations what used to be external to the firm now is becoming material, because it matters. It matters over time. It matters not within 24 hours or 1 month or 3 months, unfortunately not yet. That's why the net present value system is totally screwed up. I think markets have a real deficient tool there, because investment decisions today basically discount negative implications in the future with a net present value of almost zero, although it may threaten the whole asset bubble as it is.
Right.
So we are facing huge risks there, but I think for Bloomberg to succeed there is in all our interest. I really wish you good luck on that.
Thank you.
I know that our 5,000 companies that disclose annually, you're sucking up all the information.
That's right.
We want to make we want to make the information more relevant to you. We want to shift from accounting from what happened in the past, which companies are great about, talking about what they have done, but having more forward-looking angle, which is part of the problem.
Yep.
And then maybe over time we will get there. And but it's so important, the work you're doing. So important.
Imad, you wanted to come in.
Actually, I agree with Georg, and excellent initiative. But I think if you go back to thinking, if Bloomberg is doing that piece of it in the data world, what are the other players? And instead of duplicating the efforts, if you galvanize them to do another piece of what is needed, then you start looking at it industry by industry and say, we're going to carve it out. And you get this collective group of companies that are so powerful in their industries, instead of duplicating efforts and then you've got excess resources, although I don't think that's ever the case, you ultimately collaborate to create a better world, and you use your passions and skills differently. I think that notion of public-private partnerships to move the SDGs to the next level is going to be absolutely instrumental.
Okay, I want to open it up for our audience for questions or comments. Let me just kick off with a quote. There was a meeting of the United Nations Foundation in February, and this is one quote from the report. The language of sustainable development goals does not resonate with business. This was a meeting of US businesses. Companies do not have performance objectives that line up with the MDGs. It's essential to translate opportunities and challenges into language the business understands, such as 1, strong institutions and governance, 2, economic growth, empowerment, and opportunity, 3, infrastructure, both physical and human, and 4, innovation in products, management systems, and institutions. I just want to point out that may be true. At the same time, we have companies represented on this panel that have taken the leap, even if there is a difference in language. So let's see what some of your questions or comments are. Do we have mics? Let's take 2 at a time.
Hi, good afternoon. Andrew, this is specific to you. So on one hand, I'm thrilled that you guys are going to start looking at analytically on more on what corporations are doing and how that's integrated based on us just saying we're doing good things. On the other side, as a publicly traded company, that scares me to death. And here's why. Part of the challenge is none of us, how are you going to measure that, quantify that? And for those of us who are rated, and luckily we get good ratings, but as we all know, you chase those ratings and you chase how people perceive us or what they measure us on. So I'm curious, what are going to be some of the measurements we should be on the lookout for?
And can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. I'm Chris Taylor with Ecolab.
Did you want to take 2 questions at a time?
Yes. One more? Anyone else? Or we can start with that. We'll come back.
Sure. The 2 things that come directly to mind, one is that, just to be clear, Bloomberg will never rate you. So we've generally avoided that. I mean, there are certain kinds of internal scoring analytics that we will allow whoever the investor is to kind of create their own customized score if they want to see how companies perform relative to each other, but we won't ever do any kind of a scoring straight, well, I should say never. Never say never, but right now we certainly don't. In terms of the engagement on those particular issues, we are very, very well aware of the difficulties of this kind of hyper-transparency that's happening around all of these companies. One of the major NGOs that we are now working with is SASB, which I'm sure you've heard of. And one of the reasons that we have backed them as much as we have is because they've had such a rigorous approach to trying to just surface material issues and winnow them down so that we're not talking about the entire universe of things that a company can report out on, which is enormous and completely daunting and gives corporate capital markets attorneys headaches trying to figure out how do I protect my client and still report out on what's material. So there's this big question of what matters. And SASB was doing the heavy lifting, sector by sector, trying to figure out exactly what that minimum set of material issues would be by sector. Still up to the company to decide if it is in fact material to the company itself, but at least doing it on a sector level means that you're not looking at this huge, vast universe and trying to figure out what matters. And again, it remains to be seen whether or not we get the kind of market uptake that's going to be necessary to shift that norm so that everyone starts moving in that direction. We think, our bet is that it will eventually happen. And so, I don't know if that's much comfort to you right now, but we do think that as the reporting space starts to consolidate to some degree, we're going to start seeing a little bit more clarity about what ought to be reported and how, which I think gives a lot of companies a great deal of comfort going forward. It's a bit nerve-wracking now, and we do understand that. On the ratings issue, we also work with the global, oh gosh, I'm going to forget the GISR. What is that?
Yeah.
Not
No,
GRI.
there's a new
GISR.
initiative on rating.
The Global
with
Integrated
the Integrated Rating
Ratings,
Initiative.
yeah, something like, there's the
GIRS,
alphabet,
yeah.
the alphabet soup can be completely confounding. But the GISR is trying to look at all of the different rating systems out there and trying to examine why it is that company A gets an F on one rating and an A+ on the other. And this drives investors as crazy as it does the companies themselves. And so what we're trying to do is figure out, can we approach this not in a standardized way that collapses all ratings? I mean, clearly we want all these ratings to get to whatever nugget they're getting to, but to do it in such a way that at least it's not a black box, that you are able to follow the methodology all the way through and that you can make a judgment as to whether or not that rating in fact makes sense to you. And again, that's not going to eliminate the discrepancies. So a company may still end up falling across a whole spectrum of different kind of grades or scores. But at least from the investor side, there's going to be a lot more understanding as to why that company got there, which I think in certain ways ought to be of some comfort to the company. Again, maybe not enough comfort, but we are trying to move towards a place where those ratings are professionalized, quote unquote.
And maybe some practical, what we know from leading companies in the sustainability space, they apply 3 methodologies. One is coping, trying to show also the short-term benefits of good public-private collaboration. And if you look hard, you find more encouraging examples. One is shifting. Some companies actually shift from short-term to more long-term shareholders to have more robustness there. And companies are working also systematically with investors now to share ESG information to better communicate value that is behind sustainability long-term investments. And that is happening on a pretty large scale now too. So these are kind of tactical moves.
I just want to underscore this cross-cutting theme because it is very relevant on data collection, data monitoring, information exchange. It was important in the MDGs, and as Sharon talked about, it's important when it comes to health behaviors, when it comes to issues like mortality rates. It's increasingly important in the area of sustainable production and consumption, which is one of the focus areas in the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think more and more efforts will converge around that question of data and information. And I think we've got to get more resources into that and exchanging the knowledge and how to do it. Other questions or comments, please?
Good morning. My name is Paula Luff, and I'm with Hess Corporation. I have a quick question. Emad, I think you said that business is development and development is business, and I like that a lot. My question
It's not my quote, I'll be.
Well, but I like it, and I'm going to use it.
I won't take
I'm
credit
attributing
for
it to you.
It's going around.
Whatever. But it's great, and I think a lot of us in the private sector would agree that foreign direct investment has done a lot for a lot of economies. My question for the panel is, there's inequality within countries, as you pointed out in Kenya. The development is uneven within countries, and there are countries simply where the environment is not right for business to go, whether that's post-conflict or failed states. And I'd like your thoughts on what strategies perhaps civil society, in partnership with business and government, might pursue. Thank you.
Sure, and maybe we can start with you on that. It's interesting, I was at a philanthropy meeting in Kenya while I was there a couple of weeks ago, and I met a representative of Johnson & Johnson there. So I know you're active in that, but perhaps other countries as well that where there are great challenges. Can you say a little about that?
Yes, and I think it's an important question because there are a range of approaches that the private sector takes in development, and there's on the continuum of shared values here or shared value here. Johnson & Johnson is more on the other side of the continuum because of the fact that over 70 years ago, Robert Wood Johnson penned a credo that talks about our responsibility. It's a one-page document, but very clearly 25% of that document is focused on the communities in which we live and work and the world community as well. So much of the work that we are doing, both through our Millennium Development Goal commitment and also through the work we're doing globally for our strategic philanthropy, is in spaces where in locations where we don't have a business, where we're not likely to have a business anytime soon, but we feel it's our responsibility. On the other hand, our businesses, the commercial side of our business, is having this conversation all of the time. So within the same private sector organization, there is what we're doing with an intent to fulfill our responsibility as a corporate citizen, and then what we are doing to develop businesses, and what we do in each case is fairly different. I think the point that was raised earlier about partnerships is critical, whether it is a market where one has a business presence, where one hopes to have a business presence, or where one may not have a business presence for 50 years. The only models that we have seen that really work are partnerships that involve the mix of civil society or NGOs, governments, and in our case, UN agencies, because we find that in working with UN agencies, they have done a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of engaging government, and to see sustainable change in any of the spaces where we're working, that is a critical component. But I would say the response is probably that it looks different from company to company and country to country, and sometimes within countries as well, because it's a complex but exciting space.
Matt.
I think if you maybe fast forward however many years and we're able to shift resources that are currently in company resources that are, let's say, philanthropic or not channeled to some type of a shared value notion, if you channel that and get people to work in those markets where they do have businesses, and then allow more resources from the UN and other civil society organizations that were also doubling up the effort, if you will, in some of those markets, then you're going to create a balance. And some of the UN agencies and the civil societies will then help those markets get to the point where they are interesting for business, just like they've done for Africa today, where Africa today is that attractive because they've spent so much time and money and energy getting it to the point that companies are looking at it and saying, hey, this is attractive. So it's, I think, if you play it right, you shift resources a little bit, and maybe the companies won't be all focusing on Angola or whatever the market is, but they'll be focusing where they want, and then the civil societies will focus elsewhere.
Gary?
Plus, I would add, 1.5 billion people, by the way, live under violence. Yeah? So we are really talking of many countries around the world. 70 countries suffer from systemic corruption. But in all of these countries, you find entrepreneurship. It's a universal concept. Everywhere you find willing and able people on the ground who want to grow their business. So we continuously advise companies, invest be successful, and do so in a responsible manner. In other words, institute within your own operations good practices, set the right example. It is not always easy, but you can do it. And if you collaborate with others, like-minded companies, through local networks or other hubs that are there, and if you invest in social entrepreneurship and you support social programs that empower the poor, you help build markets, but at the same time you safeguard your own investment. And engagement is always better than disengagement, because that's how good practices spread. So we strongly advocate for investment. The short answer actually to what's the role of business in the MDGs is actually very simple. Invest, be successful, and do so in a responsible manner. You don't want to replicate crime and vodka capitalism or totally skewed systems which are not sustainable. You want to do it in a responsible way, and this is where I like to propose that the Compact's universal principles can be a helpful ethical guide because they're recognized everywhere.
Andrew, want to add to that?
I don't know if I've got anything particular on that, mostly because our work in some of these more challenging situations is really mostly through the foundation itself. So from a company perspective, the nature of our business tends not to necessarily take us directly into those areas. But I do know that from the work that we did through the foundation, partnerships, again, were very, very key. I agree.
Yes.
It wasn't until we were actually able to go see it through the eyes of people who have actually lived and built organizations on the ground within those settings that we had any compass as to how to start engaging on it. And so I would also echo that piece.
Okay. Well, I won't attempt to sum up the discussion, but just to end, obviously a couple of themes running through very strongly. One is partnerships. Another one is going back to this question of data and information. Just some ideas to follow up on. If you want to know really how to make a commitment and then live up to it, I think talk to Sharon. I think, again, Johnson & Johnson has given a really great example of that. EMAD obviously is generating a lot of important information about the spectrum of industry support for global goals and frameworks. Georg has, I'm sure you'd be delighted if more companies joined the Global Compact, though you've got plenty already, but also was pointing out that there are a lot of tools available from the Global Compact and on the website available to anyone. And Andrew, you threw down the gauntlet on better thought leadership on sustainability, so I hope we can see some of that there. And then I mentioned earlier the Hilton Foundation is engaged in this partnership with mostly private foundations, but of course I'm interested in engaging with more. There really is a lot going on to bring philanthropy and corporate responsibility more into the global goal setting. So let's thank our panelists for sharing some wonderful ideas.
Thank you.